Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jonathan Kirkup. I'm the Director of Learning and Teaching in the Department of Politics and International Relations, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what is the first of two events taking place today at Cardiff University, examining Northern Ireland and the peace process from different perspectives. This evening, my colleague, Dr. Thomas Leahy, will be hosting a roundtable discussion on the British and Irish security forces and Northern Ireland conflict. That's in the centre of student life. And this afternoon, we have three esteemed guests taking part in an informal discussion around civil servants and the peace process. Before we begin, though, I want to thank GW4, who provide the funding for these events and the camera work around that. So these events are part of a much wider research network encompassing the universities of Cardiff, Bristol, Bath and Exeter. And over the next few months, and we hope years, we'll be producing a repository of research papers and interviews on film, creating a resource which we hope will be useful for any academics or students interested in Northern Ireland and the conflict. So I'll hand over to Giada Lagana to host this event.
So I'm really pleased to see every one of you here. My name is Dr. Giada Lagana, and I am a Liverpool ECR Fellow and a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University School of Law and Politics. As you probably all know, this is a topic that is very dear to my heart, in particular because I am currently writing my second book on this very subject. And there will be one main question that we are going to address through this panel discussion today, which is what has been the role of civil servants and public bureaucrats in designing what has commonly been known as the Northern Ireland peace process. And we are going to focus on a very specific and key time in the peace process, starting with the 15 years that have preceded the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, with a very specific objective, which is remembering that the architecture of Northern Ireland constitutional settlement has been the result of the work of British, Irish and Northern Irish civil servants working in the shadow of politics to shape the environment in which compromise has eventually been possible. And we are going to explore this dimension, and we are really incredibly proud of having a stellar lineup of speakers. People who were at the forefront of these policies and politics on behalf of the British state and the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and the actors that really, we can say, designed the peace process. I start in no particular order with Sir Quentin Thomas, who was a civil servant in the Northern Ireland office between 1988 and 1998. As political director, he led the team which first met Sinn Féin following the 1994 ceasefire, and he took part in the roundtable talks which culminated in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Then we have Professor David Cooke, who was private secretary to Patrick Mayo and who later became Northern Ireland Secretary of State. He served as the head of the constitutional unit in the cabinet and worked closely with Sir Quentin Thomas and Jonathan Powell. And last but definitely not least, Professor Chris Maccabe, who was a civil servant also in the Northern Ireland office, but started his career in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. He served as private secretary to the Chief Minister of Northern Ireland during the short-lived power-sharing executive well known as the Sunningdale experiment. And between 1988 and 1991, he was director of the Northern Ireland Prison Service, while in 1992 he became head of the Political Affairs unit in the Northern Ireland office, and subsequently its political director in Belfast, an appointment coupled with the role of Joint Secretary of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. I would also like to thank Dr. Thomas Lee and Dr. Jonathan Kirkup for being amazing colleagues and for their unending support in anything that is related to research and analysis of the Northern Ireland peace process. And without further ado, John, I think we shall start.
Yes, if we start with just hopefully a simple question to all three of you. Just, did you have any preconceptions about the Northern Ireland Office before being posted to it? We'll start with, I suppose we can go along the line.
Okay. Well, the Northern Ireland Office was created when the devolved institutions collapsed and direct rule was introduced. And it grew, before that, Northern Ireland had been responsibility of the Home Office. So I went to the Northern Ireland Office in 1988 when I'd already had 20 years in the Home Office. So the Home Office was the graveyard of the devolved institution. So I did know something about it, and obviously I had colleagues who'd worked on Northern Ireland within the Home Office. And when it was set up, although it had a core of its own staff, including Chris Maccabe, the source of its staff was really from the Foreign Office, the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence. So I had colleagues who'd been to the Northern Ireland Office and come back, and others who were going, so I had a pretty good idea. It was an unusual institution in that its main mission, if understood but not stated, was its own destruction. If it could achieve a settlement and end direct rule, then the Northern Ireland Office could cease to exist. So in that sense, it was working for its own destruction, which made it quite an interesting place. It also gave it a slightly temporary character and a slightly buccaneering atmosphere, I think. It was relatively small, and it was set up as a response to an emergency, which it hoped, as I say, to see itself off.
My answer's a bit different from Quentin's, but I'm just trying to give you a flavour of what it was like at the time. There were these people who were called estabs, which is a weird word, but that's what we used to call our personnel department or our HR department. And what used to happen in the Home Office is you would get a phone call from estabs, and they would ask you where you wanted to go for your next posting. So we all said the criminal department, not for any particularly good reason, but just because criminal department sounded slightly less bad than anywhere else. And then they would always say, right, you're going to somewhere that would not be the criminal department, because they followed a principle of perversity. So they phoned me up and I said, well, how about the criminal department? Is that going free? And they said, no, you're going to the Northern Ireland Office. So, oh, great, I thought. But that is roughly how it worked, and you never got what you actually asked for. But I was quite pleased once I'd internalised the news I was going to the NIO, because I knew that quite a few people I admired and respected in the office had served time in the NIO, and I thought, well, this sounds very interesting. I know nothing about it, but, I'll give it a go.
Well, as it was sort of foreshadowed, my situation was I didn't have any preconception about the Northern Ireland Office before I was posted to it, because it didn't exist. I was working as a researcher in the Northern Ireland Cabinet Office, the devolved Cabinet Office. As a researcher, I'd just been there a few months, and suddenly it all collapsed. The government resigned, and William Whitelaw, the first Secretary of State's helicopter, arrived on the lawn outside my window. So I saw it from day one. Fortunately, I was junior enough and young enough to be gobbled up in it. There was a bit of clearing of the decks. A large number of more senior, or the most senior civil servants were replaced in the Whitelaw Office and the new administration by people, very, very talented people from England and Scotland, as the heads of it, and not many senior people were kept on from Northern Ireland, but I managed to get under the radar and stay there and spend my career there in one shape or form. And I can talk more, there are things I will be able to say at subsequent questions, but it was a lovely career. I worked with some tremendous people, and I couldn't have been happier, even though what we were dealing with was really matter of life and death, because I do believe that the political solutions that we came up with and the ultimate one saved an awful lot of lives.
So I will continue by asking you about the relationship between the NIO and the Secretary of State. And I suppose that you all, saw many Secretary of States passing. So who was, in a sense, your favorite, who was easy to work with, who wasn't? Do you have anecdotes to bring to this amazing story? Quentin, I would ask you to start.
Yeah, I worked for 4 Secretaries of State: Tom King, Peter Brook, Patrick Mayhew, and Mo Molan. I saw less of Tom King, and there was, as he himself acknowledged in a debate in the House of Commons near the end of his term, he had seen very little progress on the political side, which was the side of the office I was on. So I have less to say about him, but Peter Brook came anxious to achieve progress towards political settlement, and he was instrumental in pushing that boat out, a boat which was grabbed with eagerness by both Patrick Mayhew and Mo Molan. What I would say about relations was they were very good, but on conventional lines, that in the classic model, ministers determine strategy and policy. In determining that, they seek advice from their officials. There's an interchange and a dialogue. Sometimes officials say, in classic yes minister mode, that would be a courageous route to take, minister, and perhaps you want to hesitate before doing that. But in my experience in that department, in that period, there was an absolutely classic division of labour, a constant interaction, a mutual respect. We very much looked to our ministers to give us guidance and to set the policy in the direction. And we did our best to give effect to it and to steer them in a different direction if we thought what they were proposing was misguided or doomed to failure. And I wouldn't really want to distinguish between the styles of Peter Brook and Patrick Mayhew were relatively similar, and that of Mo Molan was rather different, but they all shared the same objective and were effective ministers in my experience.
David?
For an accidental reason, I have to focus on Patrick Mayhew, and the accidental reason is that 10 years before I started in the Northern Ireland office in 1990, I had been Patrick Mayhew's private secretary, which is a role you get very early in your career, and you are looking after a particular minister and you work very intensively over very long hours with them, and inevitably you get to know them very well. So I was very glad when Patrick Mayhew came to be the Northern Ireland Secretary, because I had this bond which went back 10 years. But this gave me a very difficult job in mid to late November 1993, which is that we had just found out that the top secret messages which the British government had been exchanging with the IRA since February 1993 were about to be published in the Observer on the Sunday of the weekend that was just coming up. So Sir John Chilcot, who was the permanent secretary at the time, said, had a stroke of genius. David, you used to be Patrick Mayhew's private secretary. You can go and tell him that these messages have leaked. So I thought, oh, great, that's
thanks a lot.
Fantastic. So I went into his office, which was a very imposing office in the old Admiralty building. It used to be Churchill's office during the beginning of the Second World War. And I went in and gave Patrick Mayhew my news. He was a very big man, Patrick Mayhew. He was at least 6'3" and seemed bigger than that. And he hit the table like that, and all his fancy china jumped up and down. And he said, David, I shall have to resign, you realise. And I, with the naivety and arrogance of youth, said, I don't think you will, Secretary of State. And why the hell I said that, I'm not too sure.
You were right.
I know why I think I said it, because we had written all of the messages to be absolutely consistent with things that ministers had said in public. And that was one of the sort of great features of the whole thing. As it happened, he put in a brilliant performance in the House of Commons. Nobody said he should resign, except for Ian Paisley, who got himself thrown out of the chamber in a way that did happen from time to time. So it went off okay, but it was a very, very nerve-wracking moment.
I can imagine. Chris?
When I was counting up, I worked for, in one shape or form, 15 Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And I do have a league table, but I'm not going to share it with you. But very, very high on the table would be Lord Mayhew, Sir Patrick Mayhew, as absolutely, I have great affection and regard for him. Also up there would be a friend, Paul Murphy, who became Secretary of State in the noughties. But two great people. I'm not in any way, they were all great, but obviously one has these things. The day that was mentioned, the breaking of that news story, I don't recall, I was there in the press conference on the morning that Sir Patrick had to face the press.
Yeah, that wasn't so good, was it?
And I have never been, I have had quite a few and still have some of them, friends in good quality, high level journalists in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. And I've always got on, and they admired our straightness, but that day, 3 of them gave me the greatest pasting for being a liar, that we had said things, and I'm interested, David, when you say that it had been straight, but the journalists didn't think that. It was, they believed that we had, that the government, and even those that were supposed to be confidants of the press in the way we were, had lied to them. And it was one of the most difficult days I had listening to it. I think there had been a statement by the Prime Minister that talking to Jerry Adams would turn his stomach, not long before, and I think that was the baton that I was beaten over the head with.
Yeah, these things can be explained, I should say, but maybe we'll get onto that.
Yeah.
The form of words mattered.
Yeah.
So, you have really highlighted, even in this way, how you were all connected, how you really worked as a team. And Quentin, I would like to ask you, since, you were, I would say, at the head of the office. So, what contributed to this unique esprit de corps, I would say, in the Northern Ireland office?
Well, obviously the excellence of the leadership, which wasn't me. It was my permanent secretary, as someone's mentioned, Sir John Chilwell. He had a collegiate approach. But I think the real answer is, as I mentioned before, the purpose of the office, really, if not stated as such, was to hold the reins, but to seek a settlement, to try and bring the crisis to an end. And there's nothing better than a team of people sharing a common purpose, which they believed to be in the public interest. So it was kind of obvious that that was what we were all trying to do. We obviously had to do day-to-day things and some of us had to deal with security matters or with the press or whatever, but the unstated but shared purpose was to seek a settlement. And I think that alone, even without the brilliant management style that we all had, brought us into a collegiate relationship, and I always felt that everyone was ready to put their shoulder to the same wheel, and that was very good. There weren't great conflicts. The other thing that helped, I think, is that in most of this period, certainly after Tony Blair took over the leadership of the Labour Party and Mo Molan became the Shadow Secretary of State, there was a complete agreement across the Houses of Parliament. There was a shared objective in Parliament as well as in the office and in Whitehall, and I think that fed through and made it. There wasn't the divisiveness came from Northern Ireland, but not from within the government system.
Okay.
What's useful? Chris?
Okay. What about instead comparing the administrative culture in the Northern Ireland Civil Service? Since you came from the Northern Ireland Civil Service and then joined what it was, well, a British public bureaucracy office made by British people mostly, but you were Northern Irish.
Yes, well, I was Northern Irish, but my time in the Cabinet Office was brief, and the Cabinet Office was not typical of the Northern Ireland Civil Service as a whole. It was politically orientated. It had the sort of freedom of movement. It had characters, if you understand what I mean, in it. They were people that had their own personality and were expected to. It wasn't a bureaucratic machine. It was quite small. So I joined that and enjoyed it. The research unit had just been set up, and I was put into that. We were really a propaganda unit, I have to say. It was a unionist government running Northern Ireland, and the first paper I had to write was SDLP Contradictions, which was referring to the opposition, and it was an unusual thing for a civil servant had to do. The second paper I had to write was Social Security Benefits North and South, comparison between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, why it's much better to live in Northern Ireland. And these papers were then distilled and used as speeches by unionist politicians and the leaders of the Prime Minister. So they were very political civil servants. The culture there was different. As I said earlier, many were moved out at the time. The school I went to in Belfast, it's called the Royal Belfast Academical Institution, had a predominance of the civil servants in Stormont Castle at that time. Having gone to the same school, and also it had an overwhelming majority of Protestants. As I recall it, there was just one Roman Catholic when I joined the Cabinet Office. Brian Faulkner, the Prime Minister, brought in a second at a senior level, Dr. Maurice Hayes from local government, but nevertheless it was very coloured in that way, and that was something I'll come to later because it had repercussions throughout the years, and it was one of those things. The culture was different, but some, and I could name them, stayed on over the years and made careers in the Northern Ireland Office. It wasn't that those that were moved out were incompetent. It was all to do with the colouring and shaping. And I said I was blessed by meeting some wonderful colleagues from England and Scotland and Wales that are friends to this day, including my two colleagues here.
Shall I see the next question? Yes. So Giada's research, as you know, is interested in dialogue, and we were both interested in you've already touched on Patrick Mayhew and Peter Brook, and the discussions that took place through that period. I don't know who wants to take it up, but where did those talks come from? How did that work? And what was the role of the civil service within that?
I have a first go. Well, as I probably implied in my earlier remarks, it was sort of inbuilt in the Northern Ireland Office that we should pursue a settlement. There had been a history of initiatives which hadn't quite worked, Sunningdale perhaps the one that came closest to succeeding. And that bred a sort of feeling that some of these were led top down, some of them came bottom up, as it were. But it had led to a certain nervousness about an initiative. But when I arrived in 1988, it was in the aftermath of the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement, which in some ways was a great step forward. It was particularly useful in making it clear that the Irish government would have a role in these developments, and that there would be, if we were lucky, something of a partnership. But it had we used to ask in the office on promotion boards and so on, so was the Anglo-Irish Agreement a good idea? And you could get sort of 50-50 answer. Some people would say, yeah, jolly good idea for the reason I've just stated, or for other reasons. Others would say, well, it was a pretty bad idea because what it did was alienate the unionist nation. So that when I arrived, the unionist politicians wouldn't talk to British ministers. Here were these pro-British politicians, but they wouldn't talk to British ministers. And they wouldn't talk very readily to British officials. So one of the first tasks, as it seemed at that time, was to get people at least to talk to each other. If you couldn't even get the Unionists to talk to the British, we were in a pretty poor way, because we wanted to bring in a lot of other people and ultimately to bring in those who were currently engaged in terrorism. And I think that idea, as I say, was of trying to find a mode of getting people to talk and work towards a settlement was sort of inbred in the NIO from its beginning. But there was also, because of the history of past initiatives, a wish to find a basis that might have a better chance of working. And I think we were working on this in part in response to the Anglo-Irish Agreement and trying to work out what the features of such a scheme would be. Well, the idea was to get everyone round the table, good idea, and have a comprehensive agenda, because some of the earlier initiatives had failed because they'd only addressed part of the problem. The Anglo-Irish Agreement itself didn't address all aspects of it. It left devolution to another day, for example. And this led to us, I remember one of the things we were doing at that time was we invented the idea of 3 strands. There would be the internal to Northern Ireland dimension, the north-south dimension, and the east-west dimension. And we'd have to work out how those could be brought together. They'd have a different cast list, because it would be an article of faith, if only for the Unionists, that the Irish government wouldn't be involved in what came to be known as Strand 1, looking at the internal government of Northern Ireland. But obviously they would be involved in the north-south dimension, and so on. And I think that was being carried on really at official initiative. But when Peter Brook came Secretary of State, he was quite independently extremely interested in trying to find a way forward in the brief period that he expected to be on the political scene. It was rather a brief period, but he worked towards a speech in January 1991 when he said to general disbelief, he believed there was now a basis for roundtable talks. And oh yeah, come off it. But he persisted with that until March 1991. He was able to announce that there was a basis for discussion among the 2 governments and the 4 then main constitutional parties. And that statement, which was the 26th of March 91, I think, was in effect the first agreed piece of prose from the process. And I think the other thing that came clear to us was the word I've just used. You needed a process in which everyone had confidence, and a key feature of it, as we sort of jointly learnt together, was that we would proceed by text. Each text both recorded any progress made, but the composition of the text as a collective exercise was itself a mode of making that progress. I probably said more than enough.
David?
Well, I mean, this may possibly lead into the next question, but for my first 2 years in the NIO in the early 90s, I thought that the 3-stranded talks, which Quentin has just been telling us about, was the only game in town. And it was not until February 1993 that I discovered that there were 2 or 3 other games in town. And Quentin told me about one of these and told me it was top secret. And this was the question of the link and the channel of communication between the British government and the IRA. So yeah, I mean, I'll just put that out there and then maybe say a bit more about it in a minute.
Yes, I think you've given me a slight cast back. You've given me an excuse. I was going to go back to the 1985, the Anglo-Irish Agreement that we were talking about that was very significant, and Quentin has already talked about it. But as a Northern Ireland person, I was working then on security and counter-terrorism, I knew nothing about the negotiations of that, even though I knew about most things. One day I was asked to try if I could talk to someone who was in the property business, because the office was looking for large premises that could be turned into a secretariat with huge security to house a new organisation, which turned out to be the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and it's Irish civil servants based in Northern Ireland. I discovered that I knew about this. I said, who else knows? Nobody. The rule was that no one from Northern Ireland should know about it. But they had to tell me, because I had to confidentially talk to one of my best friends who was a leading estate agent, without telling him exactly why we wanted it. I must say, my mind was conflicted on that. And I thought, Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who was then the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and a friend, he had actually recruited me into the Cabinet Office all the years before. I should go and talk to him and say, this is too much for me to bear, the one Northern Ireland person. But then my conscience got the better of me, and I said, I'm employed by the Northern Ireland Office, that's where my loyalty lies, and I can't go spilling this to anybody. But it was an illustration of one of the developments, and there are other things, and David has just touched on one again, that sometimes were necessary, but that made me very unhappy at that time, but professionalism took over. So the way things developed, they were right and they worked for the best, but that was one that was difficult for me.
Well, to carry on from that, tantalising. Now, that's the next. Hopefully, the next question is the right question. And notice that we get on. Yeah.
Ask what you want.
No, it's okay. Well, no, we were interested in dialogue and how you get people to talk and how that actually happens, in the real world. But who wants to take that up? I don't mind.
Well, I mean, I've mentioned the link, so maybe I should say a bit more about this thing and why it was so top secret for a long time. It isn't anymore. You can read quite a lot about it now. But what Quentin disclosed to me when he briefed me that afternoon in February was that going right back into the early 1970s, there had been a link or a back channel of communication between the British government and the IRA. It had had periods when it didn't function, but it functioned. I mean, it was sort of just being invented around the time when Willie Whitelaw met the IRA in Chelsea in 1972. It definitely was operating in 1975 when there was a long IRA ceasefire. It was brought back in 1980-81 during the first and second hunger strikes. And there's a very controversial question about whether there was actually any negotiation through the link or whether it was just signalling. And then it was reauthorised, reactivated. Some scholars say in 90, some say in 91. This is very interesting because it means that we're not absolutely clear whether it was Margaret Thatcher who authorised reopening it or whether it was John Major, but at any rate, it was. And we then received this famous or notorious message, which we genuinely thought was from Martin McGuinness, saying the conflict is over, but we need your help with how to bring it to a close. Crucially, there are 3 other sentences in it, which I can't quote from memory. You'll be glad to hear because they sound a bit bureaucratic, but they are quite important. So there was a consultation with the Prime Minister, John Major. I was too junior at the time to be there. Were you there, Quentin?
I think I probably was, but I can't recall exactly.
Well, I know what John Major has said because he's written about this in his autobiography, which is actually very, very good on this subject, I think. And his first reaction wasn't, shall we have nothing to do with this? We're going to defeat them militarily or something like that. He didn't say that. What he said was, how do I know it's not a trick? And that's the question which he and the Cabinet Secretary, Robin Butler, John Chilcott and Quentin were involved in thinking through with him, and in the end he said, well, it's a risk, it's a real political risk for me, because there are some people in my own party who will hate having anything to do with this, but I think we have a duty to explore it, to find out whether there's anything in it. I mean, there is now, as some people will know, a huge question about whether the famous words were actually drafted by Martin McGuinness or whether they were drafted by somebody else. And for what it's worth, my view is that the best interpretation is that Martin McGuinness did not draft those words. I don't think that is how he would put it. And I got to meet Martin McGuinness during my second stint in the NIO, and he wouldn't have sought British advice. For instance, he wouldn't have talked about the conflict. He would have talked about my war. So those are some of the reasons why I don't think it actually was Martin. But I think Martin McGuinness was aware of it. I think it was done on a deniable basis, and you know, that's the kind of thing that happens in politics sometimes. It started off quite encouragingly, and it enabled us to set out a position at some length in something which we called the 9-paragraph note. And then came the Warrington bombings, which, you know, all bombings are dreadful. But of course the press in England in particular thought that these, you know, forgot about all the ones that were actually going on all the time in Northern Ireland and focused on these, and there was a huge amount of publicity about it. The kind of thing that would have been enough to put many politicians off and just say, to hell with it. And John Major didn't do that. He said, no, I think we have a duty to continue. Then it started to go a bit wrong, because then you get to the nature of what the link was. And it wasn't like just, you know, getting a message and popping it into a post box or through somebody's door or something like that. There was quite a lot of spinning of the messages going on. And there was also an unauthorised meeting by a British intelligence officer who had the job of servicing the link, you know, helping them with logistics and that kind of thing. And at that point, things did get very complicated, because we started to be at cross purposes in the communications. So, you know, then we moved to the thing I've told you about, when the messages leaked into the public.
Then I'm really sorry, but I need to ask this. Who do you think then wrote the memo, if it wasn't Martin McGuinness, if you can say it?
I mean, different scholars will tell you different things, but the link consisted of about 3 people, really. At the centre of it was a Derry businessman who we now know was called Brendan Duddy, who knew Martin McGuinness very well. And he had 2 friends who were also involved. One was a former priest, Dennis Bradley, and the other was a guy with the rather improbable name of Noel Gallagher, but this was nothing to do with Oasis, let me promise you. So I think that probably 1 or more members of that team of 3 crafted the words, and Dennis Bradley has written a very recent memoir in which he says it was him. I think we've now got more people claiming authorship than, you know, we really know what to do with.
Okay.
You wanted to know about getting the basis for talks, the regular talks, as it were. I mean, as I mentioned, I think the key thing was to find a process in which everyone had confidence, and that required initially a lot of bilateral meetings and crafting forms of words to describe this process. As I mentioned earlier, the initial rules of the game, as it were laid down in the statement of the 26th of March 1991 made by the Secretary of State. But in fact, the words had been traded round the potential participants in the talks, including the Irish government, so that it was in effect an agreed text. When we showed it to people in the final version, the near final version, I think we gave people 24 hours to comment, and we gave, out of respect, the Taoiseach 48 hours, but he was so enthusiastic he wanted to rush out and say something straight away, and we said, well, if you do that, you'll ruin the whole thing. And he accepted that idea. But the key feature, I think, of the process, and we really did hang on to it as a process, was that it had a comprehensive agenda and it had an inclusive cast list, that's to say all the main political parties who were committed to constitutional methods only. Potentially it would involve Sinn Féin, but only if they renounced violence. And the two governments. And there was a rule of confidentiality, which unsurprisingly was more honoured in the breach than the observance. And there were to be separate participants in the different strands that I mentioned, but there was to be, the statement said there would be liaison between these strands, which led to the creation of something called the liaison group of officials between London and Dublin, which my opposite number, Sean O'Higgins, chaired on their side and I chaired on our side. And when we finally got people around the table, the first thing we did was to ask people to draft an agenda. So everyone wrote an agenda, and then we shared all these with each other, and then we officials tried to write a composite agenda with square brackets and so on. And one of the first issues was, where do you put the constitutional issue? Of course, the unionists wanted that first. First we've got to settle the constitutional issue, so that's number one constitution. Then go on down there. And that quite a laborious process, composite drafting of a single text. But it became, as I hinted earlier, the dominant mode of the talks process. So now you've got an agenda now, what do you want to say about constitutional issues? Well, you can all write a paper on the constitutional issue, and then you can try and composite paper with square brackets, and then you can discuss that and see if you can. And what we discovered was that there was a very considerable readiness to invest in text. You might expect this more of the Protestant tradition than of the Catholic tradition, but perhaps that's wrong. Anyway, what we found was everyone was prepared to invest in text. They were prepared to haggle over text very carefully. They were prepared to stay committed to the task until there was an agreed text. But if there was an agreed text, it was to a remarkable degree respected subsequently. Not always. For example, there was an agreement that at a certain stage the talks would move to Dublin. Everyone agreed to that, but when it came to it, actually the DUP found difficulty in moving to Dublin, so they didn't go on that. But on the whole, text was respected, and the process staggered on these successive agreed texts. And that's one of my main observations about it. The collective work on a text, agreement on a text, and respect for the text, until finally you get a text which, if you're very lucky, is called the Good Friday Agreement.
There was for the earlier stages and throughout, I had a team, it was mentioned earlier that I was head of political affairs division, and our job was to talk to everybody that we could. Obviously at one point talking to the IRA was out, although I had contacts out there who claimed to be intermediaries and did feed stuff back that I put into the system. But my team would talk to everybody on the political, and not just out there, sending messages and very subtly trying to push people in directions of what our policies and tactics were. It was interesting. We would go and talk to, we would go to a town and we would talk to perhaps the mayor, who would have his party's view or not, but you would talk to the local pharmacist, you talk to the trade unionist in charge of farmers in the area, you talk to a couple of shopkeepers, and you might talk to the local GP, and you would get what their people were feeling. And that was very important to feed in. Sometimes, generally, it would be fed back to members of the party by us saying, we really don't seem to think that in your area, in the hope that that would feed up the bigger picture. So we were always trying to enrich the knowledge that you were getting in the straightforward discussion. And I don't for a second suggest that my friends, or indeed our ministers, were naive to that, but I think that was very useful. The Irish government did the same thing. They had people in Northern Ireland, the Foreign Office, their Foreign Department had people called the Travellers, and the Travellers did what we did, and sometimes we shared the views, but it helped to build the picture, and it sometimes just gave that extra confidence of a little shove at the table, because when they went back and talked to their constituents, they might just find that the constituents thought that shove was worth it.
So John will forgive me, but I will slightly deviate from the way I had phrased the next question, and I'm going to just ask to the three of you a very yes or no quick question. Do you think that without the link, we would have had the Belfast Good Friday Agreement?
Yes.
No.
Without the link or something like
No
it.
pressure, please.
But I did mention there were other channels, and those channels I had some that were significant, two significant channels, and one day one of those channels, who was actually two people, came to me and said, we've just been taken to London to meet a man in a white coat who has told us, we know you're discussing with Chris Maccabe, stop it. And they came back to me and said, what on earth is all this about? Who is this man in a white coat that's called us to London? He didn't. So I wanted to see Quentin, who was my boss, but you were on leave. So I went to see John Chilcott, the head of the office, and Sir John said to me, Chris, I'm sorry, the man in the white coat was me. He said, there's something going on that I cannot share with you at the moment, but would you please cut all your contacts with these intermediaries that you have? But nevertheless, those people have been feeding in some useful stuff, I believe. So the answer is yes and no. It moved things forward, but we had always fallback positions.
Quentin, can I ask you the reason very quickly of your answer?
Well, I think it was obviously a crucial part of the journey to the Good Friday Agreement that the IRA abandoned their violence and that the loyalists reciprocated. But I don't myself think that the link was a necessary step in that, because I think there were a number of factors that brought that about, and I'm not an expert on it, and IRA spokesman would be much better at me at articulating it. But I doubt if the link was crucial, because what the link did was to repeat in prose, as David mentioned, publicly declared positions. The only additional value, in a way, was the fact that the government was prepared to send bits of paper to them with text in it, but there was no novel element in it. And I guess, my guess, and it is a guess, that the political leadership, specifically Adams and McGuinness, had over a long time come to a view that the violence was ineffective, but also unnecessary, because, and this John Hume obviously played and Father Alec Reid and others played a key part in articulating this view that it wasn't the British that were the problem. The British had made clear that there was to be a process of dialogue with an open agenda, that if and when a majority of people of Northern Ireland wanted a united Ireland, they would facilitate that. The difficulty wasn't the British government. The difficulty was fellow Irishmen who regard themselves as also British and Unionists, and they took the view that they'd rather not live in a united Ireland. So that the job was to find what John Hume would call an agreed Ireland, and possibly in the end persuade everyone that an agreed Ireland was better in the form of a united Ireland. And I think that view of a political journey was reached by the leadership of the provisionals, independent of the link.
Yeah, I mean, Giada does a lot of research in the archives on Northern Ireland. I do quite a lot of research around civil servants and their roles, but I think we very rarely get the voice of civil servants who are actually involved in the drafting of documents. I think we'd both be interested in just the process. So I suppose, David, but any of you really can look into this around your role and your involvement in the Downing Street Declaration.
Well, I've just been meeting myself in the archive, if you like. It's a very strange experience, actually. And you look at what you wrote in these times and you think, gosh, why were we so formal? You know, it was all Secretary of State this and, you know, PUS that and all that kind of thing. But I don't know. I mean, I hope that we haven't just reduced everything to a total state of confusion for everybody, which is a real risk. But one way of thinking about it is you need two things to get to something like the Good Friday Agreement. You need an institutional and constitutional settlement, which actually works out what you're going to do about power sharing and the north-south dimension and that kind of thing. And the second thing you need is actual peace, you know, because you can't get people involved in the other bit of the process unless you know that everybody is doing it on the same basis and not kind of just waiting until the next time they deploy their private army. So that's the sort of rather... It also doesn't help that we talk about three strands in at least two different meanings. One meaning is the one Quentin's already mentioned, which is when you're doing the institutional design, it's internal to Northern Ireland, north, south and east, west. So that's one set of three strands. But arguably there were three strands going on in 1993 as well. There was the Brooke and Mayhew talks, which had been paused, and which then led into the work that was done in the liaison group that Quentin has mentioned. There was this stuff going through the link, on which, you know, I found myself in the dismaying position of disagreeing with Quentin, which is, you know, more than my life's worth, really. And the third thing, which we haven't really explained yet, is that there was also an Irish peace initiative, which came out of the dialogue between John Hume and Gerry Adams, which started in about 1988 and then went subterranean for a while. And eventually this started to produce some ideas for solving the constitutional issue in the way that Quentin has mentioned. And the trick, and this is actually quite a difficult thing to get your head around, was to find some way of reconciling national self-determination for Northern Ireland with the notion of the consent of the Northern Ireland people. And we switched, actually, I think, very late in the day from the link to the Irish part of the peace process, which eventually resulted in something called the Downing Street Declaration of 15th of December 1993. And you might say, well, why did we have faith in the link for so long? Well, it's partly that we didn't know that this confusion had started to set into the link, and we actually received a very positive message from the IRA, as we thought, in very early November, which the IRA now say, and they said this in their Setting the Record Straight document, that they did not send, and they say it was bogus. So we'd got to a stage where it looked as though the link was beginning to get compromised, and it eventually became quite clear that we had to go down the joint declaration route rather than the link route. But they were both pursuing the same objective, which was a ceasefire or peace. And that's how all of this comes together, the notion that really you have to have the peace first, so that you can then get the constitutional arrangements and the institutional arrangements sorted out.
There was something else going on as well, of course. You were asking about text. Some of the text was collective within the process in the manner I described, and the advantage of that was that the participants had ownership of it, and they would have ownership of the outcome. But when there were the Brooke talks in 1991 and the Mayhew talks in 1992, sometimes the press said they'd broken down, sometimes said they'd run into the sand. They had come to an end because they had to take place in a gap between conference meetings, and we had to agree that gap with our Irish colleagues who were reluctant to have too long a gap because the Anglo-Irish Agreement and its central institution, the Intergovernmental Conference, would be compromised if there was too big a gap. So there was, the 1992 talks came to an end, and we hadn't found the means of holding further roundtable talks, but we didn't want to admit that the process had come to an end. We never admitted that, although the press decided that it had on our behalf. But one idea was that it would be helpful to everyone if some people said this was, like a quadratic equation which has no solution, but there is no answer to the conundrum of the conflict in Northern Ireland. Others said, well, if there is, it would be quite helpful if you could show us an outline of it. Some people said, well, you've seen that in Sunningdale, and some people, of course, say that the Good Friday Agreement was simply Sunningdale for slow learners. But this led, this idea that it would be helpful to have an outline of what an agreement might look like to show that it was feasible, at least in principle, led to British and Irish officials in the liaison group attempting to draw up what came to be known as the framework documents. Again, because of the theology, the framework for the internal government of Northern Ireland didn't involve the Irish government. We worked on that on our own, but the north, south, east, west and the constitutional bit were worked on jointly. And that was a case where officials really did produce a text, obviously ad referendum ministers at every stage. And that was published in February 1995. And I think was myself quite an important step on the road to the Good Friday Agreement. And my sense in the 96 to 98 talks, which were chaired by Senator Mitchell, which culminated in the Good Friday Agreement, my sense was that some of the participants, particularly on the nationalist and the Republican side, that their riding instructions in those talks were keep them to the frameworks, keep them more or less to that outline, and don't let them deviate too much. So that was an example where I think the lion's share of the drafting was done by officials, but jointly by officials from Dublin and London. It was very much a shared and cooperative exercise. And one of the things it asserted, of course, which has been completely dishonoured in its terms, is the proposition that whoever runs Northern Ireland should do so with rigorous impartiality between the two traditions, and that if there ever is a united Ireland, the Irish government would have to attempt the same rigorous impartiality. I don't think we've seen too much of that in the last few years myself, but it's there in the text, it's there in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. So we're getting to the end of it, so we're just at the last very two quick questions, but before actually the last one and getting to the Good Friday Agreement, Quentin, I wanted to know from you how it was to meet the first ever delegation of Sinn Féin.
Well, obviously it was a good moment to reach, and it was it was good to be round a table. It was a slightly artificial occasion because naturally enough Sinn Féin really wanted to meet ministers, and ministers wanted there to be a little process before, which was called exploratory dialogue, and so we had to construct an agenda looking at a lot of current issues. And I must say, Sinn Féin opposite numbers played the game very, with I wouldn't say with enthusiasm, but they did their best to help us through this slightly bureaucratic thing until they decided it was all rather a waste of time, and they claimed that their delegation room was being bugged, and they had a little démarche about that, which was, as we were able to say, normally one doesn't comment on security matters, but on this occasion we were able to say publicly that they weren't being bugged. Perhaps we should have bugged them, but I don't think we thought we'd learn anything interesting. But it was, we were all very polite. Martin McGuinness, who had certainly a capacity for agreeable charm, one of the first things he said to me, in fact, was, "How is Fred?" who was the agent who had conducted the link. And I said, "I know to whom you refer, but as a matter of fact, I do not know how he is." But it was slightly artificial, but it was good that we were round a table and not sort of hiding in ditches and shooting at each other.
So, last question?
Yes.
So, we're interested, I think both of us are really interested in civil service and how it works behind the scenes. So, politicians often get the kind of kudos of how negotiation happens, but how important do you think civil servants are in the negotiation process? And what ended up how you felt about the signing of the Good Friday Agreement? Do you want to start?
Yes.
Given it was,
Well, I think in the Northern Ireland situation, we were crucial because it was teamwork, and it was team right up to our ministers. We really, I'm sure my colleagues will agree, with our ministers, we were all part of a team. They were the political leaders, but everybody worked together and put it together. And colleagues were necessary from security side and even prisons and the economy were brought in to put it, but that teamwork was essential. So the team was hugely important. The captain was undoubtedly the political leader and the Prime Minister ultimately, and the same for the south of Ireland. But we were definitely, it was quite a unique situation and very satisfying to work in. And obviously the Good Friday Agreement was a huge moment for me and moment for us all. Though surpassed, I think, quite a few years later, when I stood in Parliament buildings and watched Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley take control of Northern Ireland jointly. But that was the outflowing of the Good Friday Agreement. But boy, was that some, having grown up with them and been roared at them and other things at them, to see that. But the combination with the Good Friday Agreement, without the Good Friday Agreement, none would happen. And without the Good Friday Agreement, we wouldn't be where we are in Northern Ireland today, which is not a bad place.
I agree with what Chris has said. Just on the question of the team, I mean, one of the agreeable things that happened as the talks progressed and it became, most people in the Northern Ireland office thought, we've got to do this is our duty, we try and carry it forward, but we know we're not going to succeed. Nobody succeeds, that's the sort of, that's the doomsday option. But as it became likely that the momentum really was there under Senator Mitchell's chairmanship, the circle of the team grew wider. I mean, initially it was largely the political side of the office. Then, as Chris hinted, the security side of the office began to be drawn in. The people who dealt with police matters, the people who dealt with the army, and the Foreign Office. And then, because you needed things on the agenda for the North-South body, which were the matters of domestic policy, then maybe the Department of Environment, all sorts of people gradually got drawn in, and the same thing was happening in Dublin, and the same thing was happening among the political parties. So the sense of being in a team grew and accelerated until, as Chris says, there was a very satisfying and unexpected moment.
I would just mention two very quick points. One is that it's a boring truism, but it is true that civil servants do, of necessity, operate under political direction, and any civil servant who forgets that is likely to get into a lot of trouble. But if one leaves that on one side and talks about who were the key officials, then an awful lot turns on who is the person who comes up with an ingenious new idea for moving forward just when it looks as though everything has run into the sand yet again. And on the British side, my vote would definitely go for Quentin as, above all, that person.
Very kind.
And,
Yes.
and on the Irish
Yeah.
side, Sean O'Higgeen, I think,
Yeah, I agree with that.
who was, also very fertile in coming up with solutions in very difficult circumstances.
And I would say that on this, if you could join me for a big round of applause, because this couldn't have gone any better. I thank you so much, the three of you, because
Thank
this
you.
has been amazing.
Good.